It was a crisp evening, and the city lights shimmered through the tall glass windows of one of the most exclusive banquet halls in town. Inside, the hall was filled with soft golden light reflecting off crystal chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers and polished wood. The room was grand, more like a palace than a simple hall, and tonight it was hosting an event for the city's most influential and wealthy people. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant dresses moved gracefully, holding champagne glasses and exchanging polite conversation. Laughter floated lightly over the low hum of chatter. But there was an air of quiet tension. This was an event where appearances mattered, and no one wanted to look unprepared. Among all the glittering figures, one person moved quietly and deliberately through the crowd. She was a young waitress, dressed in a neat black uniform, her apron tied firmly around her waist. She carried trays with careful balance, making her way between the tables and guests without drawing too much attention. She had been working in fine dining for several years now, and she had learned to disappear into the background when the spotlight wasn't hers. That had become her way: work hard, stay unnoticed, and survive. Tonight, she was particularly aware of the grandeur surrounding her. The tables were decorated with white linens and shining silverware. Small bouquets of roses and lily added subtle color, and soft music floated through the room from hidden speakers. But her eyes kept drifting to the far corner of the hall, where a grand piano stood alone. Its polished black surface gleamed under the warm lights, and the ivory keys looked almost like they were waiting for someone to breathe life into them. Normally, she would have ignored it. After all, she was here to serve food and drinks, not perform. But there was something about the piano tonight that called to her, something that made her fingers twitch in memory of a skill she had buried long ago. She had learned to play when she was very young, and the piano had been her closest friend for years. But life had a way of pushing people into survival mode, and eventually, she had set aside her music to focus on work that paid the bills. Tonight, however, she couldn't stop looking at it. As she moved through the crowd, she overheard snippets of conversation. "Where's the music tonight? They promised a pianist," one man murmured to his companion. "It's a shame the pianist canceled," another voice added, with a hint of disappointment. People seemed restless, glancing toward the piano now and then, waiting for someone to make the first move. Some of the guests were starting to murmur among themselves, questioning how an event of this caliber could lack live music. The young waitress kept pouring wine and clearing empty glasses, but her mind wandered. She remembered the hours she had spent practicing as a child, the way the keys felt under her fingers, the way a simple melody could fill an entire room with emotion. She could almost hear the music in her head now, soft and tentative at first, then stronger and more confident. She shook her head lightly, trying to push the thought away. She had responsibilities here, and she couldn't afford to get lost in memories. Still, as she walked past the piano, she felt her heart quicken. She paused for just a moment, brushing a finger across the polished surface. The smoothness beneath her touch brought a small, almost imperceptible smile to her lips. She had missed this feeling more than she realized, the connection between her hands and the music. She looked around quickly, making sure no one was watching, and then straightened up, resuming her work as if nothing had happened. The night went on, and the event continued. The guests mingled, sipped champagne, and admired the luxurious surroundings. Some made small jokes about the missing music, while others shrugged and focused on their conversations. The staff moved efficiently around the room, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and refilling glasses. The young waitress continued her duties, carefully balancing her tray as she walked. Her eyes occasionally flicking toward the piano, she noticed a small group of men gathered near the piano, dressed in expensive suits and speaking in low, confident tones. They were laughing quietly, but she could tell from their expressions that they were judging everything around them. including the people who worked there. One of them leaned toward another and said something with a smirk, and the young waitress caught the words, "I wonder if anyone here could even play that piano." They didn't realize she had heard, and she walked past quickly. Trying not to let her reaction show, her stomach twisted with a mixture of frustration and something else she didn't fully understand. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to sit at that piano and prove them wrong. The thought was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. She reminded herself she wasn't here to perform. She was here to work, and that was enough. But then, as she walked to serve another table, one of the guests turned toward her with a faintly mocking smile. "You look like you could play that piano," he said casually, almost joking. The others laughed quietly, expecting her to feel embarrassed. She froze for a second, unsure of how to respond. Her heart raced, but she didn't speak. Instead, she kept her hands steady on the tray, smiling politely as she passed by Dot. After a few more moments, the laughter faded, and she continued her rounds. But the seed had been planted. The piano, the mocking words, the memory of her skill, it all settled in her mind like a quiet insistence that wouldn't go away. She found herself wondering if tonight might be the night she could touch the keys again, even just for a moment. The thought made her nervous, but also alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, the event continued around her. People sipped wine, engaged in conversation, and admired the decorations. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses created a rhythm that was almost musical in itself. She moved gracefully between tables, responding to requests and clearing dishes, but her mind kept drifting back to the piano. She imagined her fingers gliding over the keys, the notes echoing through the hall, the astonishment on the faces of the guests. It was a daydream she couldn't quite shake, no matter how hard she tried. As the evening wore on, the group near the piano continued to whisper among themselves. They joked about who might attempt to play, their words laced with disbelief and subtle condescension. She overheard bits and pieces. "No one here could touch it," one said. "It's too complicated for anyone in this room," another added. A small spark of determination ignited in her chest. Maybe they were right. Maybe no one here could play. But she remembered her own hands, her own hours of practice, and a quiet voice inside her said she could. The moment passed quickly as she moved on to another table, but the thought lingered. She poured drinks with careful precision, her movements smooth and professional, but her mind replayed melodies she had learned long ago. She remembered the excitement of performing in small gatherings, the joy of creating something beautiful from nothing, the way music could speak when words could not. It had been a long time since she had felt that rush of emotion, and tonight it whispered to her insistently. By the time the first hour of the event had passed, the atmosphere in the hall had shifted subtly. Guests were growing restless, the piano still untouched, and the small group of men near the instrument were exchanging glances, as if daring someone to take a seat. The young waitress continued her work, clearing glasses and offering polite smiles, but her eyes frequently drifted toward the piano. Every time she did, a memory flickered in her mind, a melody she had once played, a chord she had once mastered, a moment when music had made her feel powerful and alive. She felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. What would it be like to sit at that piano again? Would her fingers remember? Would anyone notice if she tried? The thought made her pulse quicken, and she found herself standing just a little taller as she walked past the instrument again. For the first time in years, she considered the impossible. That maybe, just maybe, she could bring music to this room tonight. And so the evening continued. The guests laughed, mingled, and admired the lavish surroundings. The young waitress moved gracefully among them, carrying trays and refilling glasses, her mind dancing between duty and desire. The piano stood silently, waiting, its black surface gleaming under the warm lights, as if inviting her to take the first step. In that moment, something shifted inside her. A small, quiet voice told her that tonight could be different. Tonight, she might find the courage to let her hidden talent shine once more. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream. She imagined the sound of music filling the hall, the eyes of the elite guests turning toward her, the astonishment and awe that could follow. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She shook her head, trying to calm the rising excitement. But she couldn't erase the spark that had been lit. Something inside her had awakened. And she knew, deep down, that this night could change everything. And so, she continued her work, moving through the room with practiced grace, carrying glasses and trays, smiling politely at the guests, all while the piano sat silently in the corner. But her mind was no longer just on her duties. It was on the music she had left behind, the fingers that had once danced over the keys, and the possibility that she might, finally, bring that music back to life. As the evening deepened, the glow from the chandeliers cast long, warm shadows across the grand hall. Guests had settled into the rhythm of conversation and laughter, glasses clinking softly, polite smiles floating across faces. Yet in one corner of the room, the grand piano remained untouched. Its polished black surface reflected the soft golden light, and the ivory keys gleamed almost invitingly. The young waitress moved past it again, carrying a tray filled with sparkling glasses of champagne. Her mind, however, was no longer solely focused on her work. It wandered, as it had all evening, to the piano. She had always known the piano would awaken memories, but tonight it stirred more than just recollections. It stirred a longing she had buried for years. She thought of the small lessons she had taken as a child, the hours spent learning scales, the thrill of mastering a difficult piece, and the satisfaction of seeing a room fall silent as the music carried through it. She had stopped playing when life demanded her attention elsewhere, when survival took priority over passion. But tonight, in this grand hall, surrounded by people who thought of her only as a waitress, that old desire flickered to life again. The small group of elite guests, who had been whispering near the piano, were still there, their expressions a mixture of boredom and quiet amusement. One of them leaned closer to another and said in a tone that carried just enough volume to reach the ears of anyone passing by, "I wonder if anyone here could even play that piano. It's probably too complicated for anyone in this room." The words were meant as a joke, but they carried the subtle sting of condescension. The young waitress felt her stomach tighten at the comment. She clenched her jaw slightly, reminding herself that she was here to work. She needed to stay calm, professional, invisible. Yet the words lingered in her mind, refusing to fade. They poked at something deep inside her, a mix of pride, frustration, and longing. She wanted to prove them wrong, but the rational part of her whispered caution. This was not her world, not her stage. She was a server, someone who moved unseen among these people, someone whose job was to make others' lives smooth and comfortable. Standing up to them, showing her skill, could be risky. She didn't even know if her fingers remembered the music as vividly as her mind did. Still, she couldn't ignore the pull. Every time she walked past the piano, her fingers itched to touch the keys. She imagined the sound she could create, the first tentative notes, the melodies spreading through the hall, the shift in the room as the music captured attention. A small, quiet voice inside her urged her to step forward, to take a risk, to bring a moment of beauty into a place that so often measured value by wealth and status. The group of men noticed her lingering near the piano, and one of them smirked. "Looks like she's interested," he said, nodding toward her. The others laughed softly. "Do you think she could really play?" "She looks like she's just serving drinks," another replied. Their words were not cruel, exactly, but they were dismissive, wrapped in a thin layer of amusement. They expected embarrassment, expected her to blush and move away. What they did not expect was the small spark that lit in her eyes. She continued her rounds, trying to focus on carrying trays and filling glasses, but the whispers and laughter trailed after her like shadows. She poured champagne into delicate flutes, moving carefully among the guests, all the while listening to their soft jokes. Every chuckle, every whispered remark, chipped away at the calm she had tried to maintain. By the time she set down her tray and wiped her hands on her apron, she could no longer ignore the thought that had taken root in her mind. Maybe she could sit at that piano and play Dot. It was a dangerous thought, and she knew it. She had not played in years. What if she made a mistake? What if she stumbled over a note or forgot a melody in front of these people who had never expected anything from her? The risk of humiliation was real, and yet the desire to express herself, to remind herself of who she truly was, beyond the apron and the tray, felt stronger than fear. She felt her pulse quicken and a warm heat rise to her cheeks. This was more than temptation. It was an urgent call she could no longer deny Dot, and then it happened. One of the men, emboldened by the small crowd that had gathered around the piano, leaned slightly toward the young waitress and said in a teasing tone, "Why don't you give it a try? Surely someone who moves around this room all evening must have some hidden talent." The others laughed, some more softly than the first speaker, anticipating the spectacle they expected to follow. They did not consider that beneath her unassuming appearance lay years of practice, of quiet dedication to a skill she had kept private. The young waitress froze for a moment, holding her tray a little tighter than usual. The words hung in the air, the laughter echoing faintly off the high ceilings. She could feel all eyes subtly shifting toward her, curious, amused, expectant. In that instant, the hall seemed to shrink, the chandeliers growing brighter, the polished floor reflecting every subtle movement. The piano waited silently, as if aware that tonight it would no longer sit idle. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her heart pounded like a drum, yet there was a strange clarity in her mind. She remembered the small lessons from her youth, the slow, careful practice of scales, the rhythm that had once felt as natural as breathing. She could almost feel her fingers remembering their old dance, the way each key responded to a gentle touch, the subtle pressure that brought notes to life. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the music flowing from her hands, filling the hall, capturing attention, commanding respect. The small group of guests watched her, smirks on their faces, still expecting a humorous display, expecting her to stumble and return to serving drinks. Some whispered to each other, speculating on what she might play, laughing quietly at the idea of a waitress daring to approach the piano in such a grand setting. Others were more curious, their eyebrows slightly raised, wondering if perhaps, against all odds, she might surprise them. She moved slowly, deliberately, setting down her tray on a nearby table. Each step toward the piano felt heavy, yet purposeful. Her breath was steady, even as her pulse raced. She reached the piano, running her fingers lightly over the polished surface before lifting the lid. The ivory keys gleamed under the chandelier light, each one a promise, a challenge, a memory. She lifted the fallboard, hesitated for a heartbeat, and then lowered her hands onto the keys. The room went quiet, as if sensing what was about to happen. Conversation slowed, laughter softened, and all eyes turned toward her. Even the staff paused in their work, noticing the subtle change in the atmosphere. The men who had teased her leaned forward slightly, intrigued, still wearing faintly amused expressions, expecting some kind of awkward attempt. They did not anticipate the calm focus that settled over her, the quiet confidence that had grown from years of private practice and patient skill. She pressed down on a single key, letting the note resonate. It was soft, tentative, almost shy, but it carried a warmth that filled the immediate space around her. The sound lingered, echoing faintly off the high ceilings, and the air seemed to vibrate with possibility. She took a small breath and played another note, then another, letting her fingers find their rhythm, their memory guiding them through patterns she had once known by heart. The hall was no longer filled with chatter. It was filled with music, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, attention shifted from polite observation to silent awe. The group of men near the piano stiffened slightly, their expressions changing from amusement to curiosity, then surprise. The young waitress's fingers moved with increasing confidence, her movements smooth, fluid, and precise. Each note seemed deliberate, purposeful, yet effortless. The melodies she had once played in private, for no audience, for no recognition, now filled the room with beauty and emotion. She felt herself becoming immersed, lost in the music, the fear melting away and leaving only focus and passion. Guests turned in their seats, drawn toward the piano. Conversations had stopped entirely, replaced by the sound of keys being played with unexpected skill and artistry. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, unable to believe what they were hearing. The laughter of a few who had mocked her earlier faded into embarrassed silence. The quiet was heavy, expectant, charged with the energy of a performance nobody had anticipated. The young waitress continued, letting the music flow naturally from her fingertips. She improvised subtly, blending the melodies she had learned long ago with the emotions she felt in that very moment. Each note carried not only sound, but a story of years spent away from her passion, of struggle and survival, of longing for recognition and expression. The hall, once filled with polite conversation and amusement, had transformed into a space of wonder and attention. Even the men who had first challenged her leaned back slightly, astonished. Their whispers had stopped. They had expected awkwardness. Instead, they witnessed mastery, emotion, and grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Every note she played reaffirmed her presence, her talent, and her worth in a world that often overlooked people like her Dot by the time she allowed herself a brief pause. The room was captivated. A few guests sat frozen in their chairs. Some whispered to one another in disbelief, and others simply stared, caught in the unexpected beauty of the music. The young waitress breathed deeply, F. The moment her fingers touched the keys, the room seemed to hold its breath. At first, it was a single note, clear and delicate, cutting through the faint background hum of glasses and distant chatter. It was soft, almost shy, yet it had a weight to it, a presence that commanded attention without force. The young waitress's heart thumped in her chest, but she kept her hand steady. She had done this before, countless times in the quiet of her childhood bedroom, in the evenings when no one could hear but herself. But this was different. This was real. People were watching. They were expecting something awkward, perhaps even foolish. She allowed her fingers to move naturally, letting memory and instinct guide her. The first melody she played was simple, almost tentative, a soft arpeggio that spiraled gently into the air. She felt the piano respond beneath her touch, each note ringing true and clear. The hall, once filled with polite conversation and laughter, had become a canvas for the music. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses were paused halfway to lips. Eyes that had been darting around the room now focused entirely on the small figure at the piano bench. At first, a few of the elite guests exchanged quiet glances. Some raised their eyebrows in disbelief, as if unsure they were actually seeing what they thought they were seeing. The small group who had teased her earlier leaned forward slightly, smirks frozen on their faces, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. They had expected humiliation. They had expected comedy. Instead, they were witnessing something that demanded respect, something they could not dismiss with a joke. She took a steadying breath and allowed the music to grow. Her fingers moved more confidently now, the notes flowing with a rhythm that was both deliberate and free. She began to play a piece she had once learned as a child, a composition that had always challenged her, that had once taken hours to master. Now, after years away from the piano, her fingers remembered the patterns as if they had never forgotten. She added small flourishes, improvisations born of her own memory and creativity, allowing the melody to evolve naturally. The hall reacted subtly at first. A few guests leaned in, their expressions softening, their eyes widening as they took in the unexpected skill before them. The sound filled the space, bouncing off the walls and chandeliers, wrapping the room in warmth and beauty. Even the staff paused, trays in hand, caught by the music. It was as if the piano had transformed the room, commanding attention not through grandeur or wealth, but through the simple, pure power of sound. Her fingers danced across the keys, moving faster now, more confidently, yet with precision. Every note carried emotion, a story she could not entirely name. It was a mixture of years spent waiting, of longing, of quiet determination. She thought briefly of the people who had doubted her, the whispers, the smirks, the teasing, and let those memories feed her focus rather than her fear. The music was no longer just a performance. It was a declaration. She was more than what they saw. She was talent, skill, and passion given form. The group of men who had first challenged her shifted in their seats, clearly taken aback. Their eyes followed her hands, their mouths slightly open, as if trying to comprehend how someone so ordinary, so unassuming, could command a piano with such expertise. Some leaned closer to each other, whispering quietly, unable to hide their astonishment. One muttered, almost under his breath, "I didn't expect this." "Not at all." His companion nodded slowly, unable to look away from the small figure at the piano. Other guests, those who had initially dismissed her, found themselves drawn closer. They shifted in their seats, their eyes fixed on the performance, some forgetting their drinks entirely. Even those who had arrived with little interest in the event or the music felt a tug at something deep within them. There was a purity to what she played, a sense of honesty and vulnerability that few had expected. It was not just skill. It was expression, something that transcended wealth, status, and the trappings of society. Her fingers moved with fluidity now, as if the piano had become an extension of herself. She allowed the melody to rise and fall, softening in some places, striking with boldness in others. She improvised gently, adding small variations that were subtle yet remarkable. Each note seemed to speak, to reach toward the listeners, connecting them to her story, her history, and her hidden talent. The room had shifted completely. The laughter, the murmurs, the polite chatter, all had disappeared, replaced by silence and attention. A few guests instinctively held their breath, leaning in closer to catch every nuance. One woman reached for her companion's arm, her eyes wide with astonishment, whispering something that went unheard, but was clearly full of amazement. Another man, who had been impatiently glancing at his watch earlier, now sat back, eyes closed for a moment, letting the music wash over him. Even the small group who had teased her earlier had fallen into stillness. Caught between disbelief and admiration, the young waitress felt a strange sensation as she played, a mixture of exhilaration, nervousness, and liberation. It was as though every hour she had spent away from the piano, every job she had taken to survive, every moment she had felt invisible, had led to this. She was no longer a simple server moving unnoticed among wealthy guests. She was the voice of the music, the one who commanded the room not with words or wealth, but with her hands, her skill, and her courage. She moved into a faster section of the piece, the notes flowing in rapid succession, yet each one remained clear and deliberate. The audience's reaction shifted subtly. They were leaning in more, their expressions intense, their attention absolute. The music carried emotion, excitement, longing, triumph, vulnerability, and it was impossible to ignore. It was no longer entertainment. It was a story, and she was telling it without words. Her hands moved confidently now, gliding over the keys with precision and grace. She transitioned into an improvisation, a melody that grew organically, weaving the old with the new, memory with emotion. Each note carried intent. Each chord conveyed her passion, her history, and her hidden strength. The music built slowly, crescendoing in a way that was both natural and captivating. It was impossible for the audience to remain indifferent. Some guests unconsciously held their breath as the music swelled. The room, once filled with casual conversation, had become a sanctuary of sound. She played with a freedom she had not felt in years, each movement of her hands translating thought and feeling into audible emotion. Even those who had initially doubted her found themselves leaning closer. Drawn into the story the piano was telling, she allowed herself a moment of reflection as she played, brief pause between phrases, a subtle emphasis that made the room lean in even further. She realized she was no longer thinking about the men who had mocked her, the teasing comments, or the assumptions about her abilities. She was fully present in the music, in the moment, letting every note carry her story. The piano and she had become one, and the hall responded in kind. Guests whispered softly to each other, some openly exchanging astonished glances. One man shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief, while another simply stared, unable to speak. The music was more than beautiful. It was transformative. People were experiencing it differently. Some feeling nostalgia, others feeling joy. A few touched by the unexpected courage and skill of someone they had underestimated. The young waitress allowed the music to swell again, rising to a gentle climax. Her fingers danced with precision and passion, each chord resonating through the room. She felt her body relax, a sense of liberation washing over her. For the first time in years, she was no longer invisible. She was seen, heard, and acknowledged not by words, not by money or status, but through the pure language of music. Even the staff, usually preoccupied with trays and tasks, stopped in their movements, leaning slightly as they listened. A waiter carrying a tray of desserts froze mid-step, eyes wide, unable to tear attention away from the pianist. The atmosphere in the hall had completely shifted. The music had taken control, transforming the space from a social gathering into a shared experience, one that connected every listener to something greater than themselves. The young waitress felt a thrill as she continued. She had expected nervousness, perhaps even failure. She had not expected this, the total absorption of everyone in the room, their complete focus on her hands and the music. Her fingers moved more confidently now, navigating complex chords and flowing melodies with ease. The improvisation grew richer, more expressive, allowing her personality, her experience, and her emotion to shine through. She glanced briefly at the audience. Some guests had leaned forward in their chairs, eyes wide with astonishment. Others were softly whispering to companions, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and admiration. The men who had mocked her earlier remained near the piano, their initial smirks gone, replaced by shock and respect. They had underestimated her, and it was impossible for them not to see it now. Every note seemed to carry a piece of her life, the struggles, the sacrifices, the quiet moments of practice she had hidden from the world. It was no longer just music. It was revelation, confession, and triumph all at once. The piano was her voice, the instrument through which she told her story without a single word. The sound filled the hall, echoing off the walls, intertwining with the soft murmurs of those too captivated to leave thee. As the last notes of her initial melody lingered in the hall, the young waitress felt a shift in the room, a subtle change in the energy around her. The applause that had begun was warm, but polite, almost hesitant, as if the guests were still coming to terms with what they had just heard. She allowed herself a small, quiet smile, letting the moment settle for just a heartbeat before she continued. There was no hesitation now. Her hands moved back over the keys, more confidently, carrying with them the momentum of the first performance. The music began to flow again, this time richer, fuller, more expressive than before. The hall was silent, completely absorbed in the sound. Conversations had vanished entirely, replaced by an almost sacred attention. Guests turned their bodies toward the piano, leaning forward slightly, eyes wide, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. Even the staff, who were usually focused on trays and service, stood still, listening intently. The piano had transformed the room into a shared experience, a place where wealth and status did not matter, only the music and the emotion it carried. She began to play a piece that was both familiar and challenging. It was a composition that she had once struggled with in her youth, a piece that had tested her skill and patience. Now, after years of absence from the instrument, her fingers moved with a confidence born of both memory and emotion. She added subtle variations, small flourishes, that gave the melody her own signature. Each note resonated through the hall, filling it with warmth, depth, and feeling. The elite guests were captivated. Some leaned closer, their eyes fixed on her hands as they danced across the keys. Others closed their eyes briefly, letting the music wash over them, feeling its emotion and intensity. The small group who had teased her earlier had stopped whispering entirely. Their smirks had faded, replaced by astonishment. One of them shifted. In his seat, leaning forward with an expression he could not hide, while another simply stared, unable to look away. They had expected awkwardness. Instead, they were witnessing mastery, skill, and raw emotion. The young waitress allowed herself to feel the music fully. She let her emotions guide her fingers, blending the technical precision she had learned in years of practice with the depth of feeling she carried within her. Each note became a story, each chord a sentence, each phrase a paragraph of the narrative she had kept hidden for so long. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a voice, a bridge between her inner world and the room filled with people who had underestimated her. She transitioned into a section of the piece that was slower, more contemplative. The notes were soft, almost fragile, carrying with them a sense of longing and reflection. The guests leaned in even more, some whispering to each other in awe, unable to comprehend the depth of what they were hearing. The music touched something universal in them, a sense of beauty, of emotion, of connection that transcended social boundaries. Even the most skeptical of the guests could not resist being moved. Her fingers glided over the keys, shifting effortlessly between delicate passages and more powerful, resonant chords. The hall seemed to breathe with her, the energy of the room responding to the ebb and flow of the music. She could feel the attention, the focus, the astonishment in the air, and it gave her courage, confidence, and strength. She was no longer just a waitress. She was an artist, a storyteller, a force that could captivate a room with nothing but talent and emotion. The guests' reactions continued to evolve. Some had their hands pressed lightly against their mouths, unable to contain their surprise. Others had leaned so far forward in their chairs that they appeared to be holding their breath. There was a sense of collective awe, a shared realization that they had misjudged her entirely. They had assumed she was just another server, someone invisible, someone without extraordinary skill. Now, in front of their very eyes, she was proving them wrong with every note. She shifted once more, moving into a faster, more intricate section of the composition. Her fingers flew over the keys with precision, her movements fluid and natural. The music was no longer just melodic. It was expressive, vibrant, alive. It carried excitement, passion, and a sense of freedom. The guests were enthralled, leaning closer, unable to tear their eyes away from the small figure at the piano bench. The room had been transformed from a polite social gathering into an intimate concert, a space where music spoke louder than words, or wealth. The small group of men who had been mocking her at the beginning were now completely silent. Their expressions had shifted from amusement to disbelief, then to admiration. They could not hide the astonishment on their faces as they watched her fingers move with skill and grace. One of them whispered something to another, but even that voice carried a tone of reverence rather than mockery. They had expected embarrassment. Instead, they were witnessing something extraordinary. Other guests were visibly moved. A few had closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, while others sat rigidly in their chairs, their attention unwavering. The young waitress could feel their presence, their awe, and it inspired her to play even more freely, to express herself fully without fear or hesitation. She let the music guide her, allowing her emotions to shape the melody, the rhythm, and the dynamics. She transitioned into a section that was more dramatic, more powerful, commanding the full attention of the room. Her hands moved with confidence, striking chords with precision and passion. The music filled the hall, resonating in every corner, touching every listener. The guests were silent, completely absorbed, as if the piano had become the center of their world. Even the staff, usually preoccupied with tasks and responsibilities, stopped to listen, caught in the beauty and intensity of the performance. The young waitress allowed herself a brief glance at the audience. She could see the astonishment on their faces, the disbelief, and the awe. Some were whispering to each other, pointing subtly, their expressions a mixture of admiration and surprise. Others were leaning forward, captivated by every movement of her hands, every note that echoed through the hall. The music had not only captured their attention, it had transformed it, creating a shared experience that transcended social boundaries and expectations. She continued to play, letting the music flow naturally, improvising subtly as she went. Each variation, each flourish, each nuanced chord carried a part of her story, her emotions, and her skill. The room responded instinctively, the energy, shifting with the music, creating a dialogue between her and the audience. She felt a deep connection with the listeners, a sense of unity and understanding that went beyond words. The hall was completely captivated. The guests, who had arrived expecting elegance and entertainment, were now witnesses to something far more profound, a raw, authentic display of talent and emotion. The music spoke to them in ways that conversation never could. It revealed a side of the young waitress that they had never imagined, a side that was strong, talented, and full of life. Her fingers moved faster now, effortlessly navigating complex passages, blending technical precision with expressive freedom. She allowed herself to feel the music completely, to immerse herself in the sound, the rhythm, and the emotion. The hall responded in kind, the energy of the room lifting with every note, creating a shared experience that was both intimate and powerful. The guests were completely enthralled. Some whispered in awe, others simply stared, unable to tear their eyes away. The small group who had once mocked her were now silent, their expressions transformed from amusement to admiration. They had underestimated her, and the realization was evident in every subtle movement, every exchanged glance. She allowed the music to swell, building to a climax that was both dramatic and emotional. The notes rang out, filling the room with sound, energy, and emotion. The guests leaned forward, caught in the power of the performance, unable to look away. Even the staff, who had been quietly observing, were visibly moved. Their attention fully captured Dot as the music reached its peak. She felt a sense of exhilaration and liberation. She was no longer invisible, no longer confined to the role of a server. She was seen, heard, and appreciated, not for her appearance or her job, but for her talent, her skill, and her courage. The hall had become a space of shared admiration, a space where music spoke louder than words, and where the young waitress had become the center of attention, commanding respect and awe. She began to bring the piece to a gentle conclusion, allowing the final notes to linger in the hall. The room was silent, breathless, as if holding on to the last sound, unwilling to let it fade. The applause began slowly, softly at first, then rising steadily as more and more guests joined in. The sound was warm, genuine, and filled with admiration. The young waitress leaned back slightly, her heart racing, a mixture of relief, pride, and joy washing over her. She had done it. She had faced the challenge, ignored the doubts, and allowed her talent to shine. The hall, once filled with polite conversation and polite applause, had been transformed into a space of wonder and shared experience. The music had captivated the audience, changed perceptions, and revealed a hidden depth in someone they had underestimated. For a moment, she simply let the applause wash over her, allowing herself to feel the full impact of what had just happened. She was no longer invisible. She had taken a step into the light. The applause from the hall was growing louder, filling the space with warmth and admiration. The young waitress sat at the piano, hands resting lightly on the keys, breathing in deep and steady. Her heart still raced, but the nervous tension that had gripped her when she first considered playing had melted into exhilaration. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The music had not only captured the attention of the guests, but also allowed her to reclaim a part of herself she had long set aside. She glanced at the audience. Faces that had once been skeptical were now open with amazement. Some guests were whispering to each other in astonishment, their eyes wide, unable to believe what they had just heard. The group who had mocked her earlier had become silent, their expressions transformed into ones of respect. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that the young waitress had exceeded every expectation, every assumption they had made. A few guests approached slightly, standing to get a better view, as though drawn closer by the magnetic pull of her talent. There was an unspoken shift in the room, a recognition that this was not merely a casual performance. It was an extraordinary display of skill and passion, emerging from someone they had underestimated, someone they had not thought capable of such artistry. The young waitress felt a mixture of pride and humility, knowing that she had given everything she had to this moment, and it had resonated far beyond what she could have imagined. Encouraged by the response, she began to play again, letting the music flow even more freely than before. Her fingers moved over the keys with a combination of confidence and grace, the melodies building in complexity, rhythm, and emotion. She allowed herself to improvise, blending familiar pieces with spontaneous variations that reflected the rawness of the moment and the intensity of her feelings. The piano became an extension of herself, a channel through which she could communicate without words, allowing the audience to understand her story through sound alone. The hall was completely absorbed. Conversations had vanished entirely, replaced by silence and attention. Even the staff, who had been quietly observing from the sides, stopped to listen, caught in the spell of the music. The guests leaned in, their faces reflecting awe, curiosity, and admiration. Some were unable to hide their astonishment, mouths slightly open, eyes wide, their attention fixed entirely on the performance unfolding before them. She moved into a section that required both technical precision and emotional depth. Her fingers navigated complex patterns effortlessly, flowing from one chord to the next with a natural rhythm. She added subtle flourishes and ornaments that enhanced the melody, creating layers of sound that were both intricate and expressive. Every note was deliberate, yet every note carried emotion, hope, longing, joy, and the quiet determination she had nurtured for years. A few guests exchanged glances, whispering quietly to one another. "She is incredible," one said, barely audible. Another nodded, eyes fixed on the pianist. "I never imagined." They trailed off, unable to find words that captured the impact of what they were witnessing. The young waitress felt their recognition, their astonishment, and it bolstered her confidence. She could feel a connection forming, a silent understanding between her and the audience. The small group of men who had mocked her earlier were now visibly unsettled. Their earlier amusement had vanished, replaced by a mixture of surprise and admiration. One of them whispered to another, the words soft and tentative. She is remarkable." They could not hide the respect that had replaced their condescension. They had assumed she would falter, that their teasing would provoke embarrassment. Yet she had turned their expectations upside down as the music swelled. The young waitress allowed herself to become fully immersed. She felt the emotion in each note, the resonance of every chord, and she let it guide her movements. The improvisation grew richer, more elaborate, and the audience responded instinctively. Some leaned forward in their chairs, unable to look away. Others closed their eyes briefly, savoring the sound, letting it wash over them. The room was filled with a collective sense of wonder, a shared experience that transcended social boundaries and status. She transitioned seamlessly into a more dramatic section, allowing the music to take on a powerful, commanding presence. Her fingers moved swiftly, striking the keys with precision and passion. The sound reverberated through the hall, echoing against the walls and ceiling, creating an almost tangible energy that seemed to envelop everyone present. The guests were captivated, their attention unwavering. Even those who had arrived with little interest in the evening or the music found themselves drawn into the performance. Unable to look away, the young waitress felt a thrill as she played, a mixture of exhilaration and liberation. She had stepped into a world that had once felt closed to her, a world where her talent had been hidden, and now she was claiming it with every note. She felt powerful, not in the sense of authority or control, but in the quiet, undeniable force of her own ability and passion. The music carried her story, her journey, and the audience responded with an unspoken understanding that transcended words. A few guests were visibly moved, some brushing a hand over their faces as they tried to contain emotion. Others whispered to companions, pointing subtly, their expressions filled with awe. The small group who had once mocked her were now silent, their initial assumptions shattered. They had underestimated her, and the realization was evident in every glance, every subtle movement. Their respect was no longer tentative. It was genuine, rooted in the undeniable truth of what they had witnessed. Encouraged by the response, she continued to play, allowing the music to evolve naturally. She added layers of expression, shifting dynamics from soft, delicate passages to powerful, resonant chords. Each note carried intention, each phrase communicated emotion, and the audience was drawn into a shared experience that transcended social hierarchy, wealth, and status. The room was united in its admiration, captivated by the raw, authentic talent unfolding before them. She could feel the energy of the room responding to her playing. There was a subtle hum in the air, a vibration that seemed to flow between her and the audience. The applause that had begun earlier now mingled with the music itself, creating a resonance that fueled her performance. She smiled faintly, letting herself be carried by the moment, confident in the knowledge that she had captured the attention and admiration of everyone present. Her fingers moved with increasing speed and precision, navigating intricate passages with ease. She allowed herself to be expressive, letting the emotion she felt guide every movement. The music became a dialogue, a conversation without words, between herself and the audience. She was telling her story, revealing her hidden skill, and challenging the assumptions that had been made about her from the moment she entered the hall. The guests were entranced. Some sat rigidly, unable to tear their eyes away from the piano. Others leaned forward, their faces reflecting disbelief and admiration. A few whispered softly, exchanging glances, as if trying to comprehend how someone so unassuming could command such skill. The small group who had mocked her were now fully attentive, their earlier confidence replaced by astonishment and respect. She allowed the music to reach its peak, a powerful, expressive climax that filled the hall with sound and emotion. Her fingers flew over the keys with confidence and grace, each note resonating with clarity and depth. The room seemed to pulse with the music, the energy of the audience blending with her own to create a shared moment of awe and connection. The young waitress felt a deep sense of accomplishment as she played. She had faced the challenge, ignored the doubts, and allowed her talent to shine. The applause that followed the climax of her performance was immediate and enthusiastic. Hands clapped, some guests rose to their feet, and the sound of admiration filled the hall. She leaned back slightly, catching her breath, feeling a mixture of pride, relief, and joy. A few guests approached cautiously, drawn by the performance and eager to speak. One, a man with an air of quiet authority, stepped forward and smiled warmly. "That was extraordinary," he said. "You have a gift that should not be hidden." Another nodded in agreement, his eyes reflecting genuine admiration. The young waitress felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time, she realized that her talent had not only been acknowledged, but celebrated. The small group, who had mocked her earlier, now approached, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and respect. One offered a tentative apology, acknowledging that they had underestimated her. Another simply nodded, unable to find words that fully captured their admiration. The young waitress accepted their gestures with quiet grace, understanding that their recognition, however delayed, was a testament to the impact of her performance. The music producer attending the event, who had been observing quietly from a distance, stepped forward, a look of genuine excitement on his face. "I would love to discuss your talent further," he said, his tone warm and encouraging. "There is potential here that cannot be ignored." The young waitress felt a mixture of surprise and exhilaration. This was an opportunity she had never imagined, a chance to turn her passion into something more than a private memory dot as the guests continued to react. The young waitress felt a sense of fulfillment that went bay. The young waitress finally lifted her hands from the piano keys, letting the last notes linger in the hall, resonating softly before fading into silence. The room remained still for a heartbeat, as if the guests were hesitant to break the spell she had created. Then, as if released from a collective hold, applause erupted louder, more genuine, and more heartfelt than anything she had imagined. Hands clapped, some guests rose to their feet, and the sound of admiration filled every corner of the hall. She felt her heart swell with a mixture of relief, pride, and joy. This was beyond recognition. It was affirmation, proof that talent, courage, and perseverance could shine even in the most unlikely places. She allowed herself a small, humble bow, her face flushed with emotion. The applause continued, rolling over her like a wave. Some of the guests whispered excitedly to each other, while others stood silently, awestruck by the display of skill and emotion they had just witnessed. The young waitress had not only played beautifully, but had transformed the entire room. The elegant hall, the elite guests, the whispers and judgments, they had all become secondary to the music, secondary to her expression and presence. The group who had teased her at the beginning now approached cautiously. Their initial smirks were gone, replaced by something she hadn't expected: respect. One of them, a tall man with a composed demeanor, stepped forward and spoke softly, almost reverently. We were wrong to underestimate you." That was remarkable. Another nodded, eyes wide with genuine astonishment. "We thought you were just a waitress. We see now how foolish that was. You have a rare gift." She nodded politely, allowing their words to be acknowledged, but she did not seek their praise. What mattered was not their approval, but the realization that she had finally stepped fully into her own potential. Guests continued to gather around, offering quiet words of admiration. Some shook her hand gently, others smiled warmly, and a few simply stared, too moved to speak. Even the staff, who had watched from a distance, approached with expressions of awe. Their words were simple, heartfelt, and sincere. "That was incredible. I didn't know you could play like that. You've amazed us all." She felt a warmth in her chest, a sense of connection that went beyond the roles assigned in the room. For a moment, she realized that she had not only shared her talent, but had created a bond, however fleeting, with everyone who had witnessed it. A man in the back of the hall, who had remained quiet throughout the performance, stepped forward. There was a professional air about him, a subtle presence that suggested experience and authority in the world of music. He extended a hand toward her, eyes bright with excitement. "You have a gift that cannot remain hidden," he said warmly. "I would like to help you explore this further. There are opportunities for someone with your talent, and I hope you will consider them." Her breath caught in her throat. This was an opportunity she had never dared to imagine, a chance to move beyond the role she had known for so long, to step into a world where her skill could be nurtured, celebrated, and shared. She felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of hope, disbelief, and anticipation. This was not just an offer. It was validation, a bridge to a future she had once thought impossible. She nodded slowly, words failing her in the face of the sudden possibility. The man smiled gently, sensing her hesitation but not pushing. "Take your time," he said, "but know that this is just the beginning. Your talent deserves to be seen and heard." She felt a deep gratitude, not only for the opportunity, but for the recognition of her dedication and courage. As the applause continued to ripple through the hall, she allowed herself to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the years she had spent in quiet practice, of the moments when she had doubted herself, when life had demanded her attention in ways that left little room for music. She remembered the longing she had carried, the desire to play, the small triumphs of mastery in private moments. All of that had led to this night, this performance, this undeniable proof that her talent was real and valued. The music had not only transformed the room, it had transformed her. She felt a new confidence, a quiet strength that came from embracing her true self, from allowing her skills to shine despite fear, doubt, and the expectations of others. She had faced a challenge, risked vulnerability, and emerged not only successful, but empowered. The experience had reinforced something she had always known deep down, that her worth was not determined by her job title, her social standing, or the assumptions of others. It was determined by her dedication, her courage, and her willingness to embrace her gifts. Guests approached her individually, expressing admiration, curiosity, and encouragement. Some asked about her background, eager to know more about the person behind the music. Others shared their own experiences, their own moments of discovery and surprise, creating a conversation that flowed naturally, bridging gaps of class, age, and expectation. She listened politely, responding with humility and grace, appreciating the genuine interest in her life and talent. The music producer remained nearby, observing quietly, but with a smile that suggested excitement and anticipation. He spoke with a few of the guests, explaining that he had recognized rare potential in the young waitress and hoped to help her develop it further. The guests nodded in approval, their earlier doubts replaced by admiration for both her skill and the integrity with which she carried herself. The atmosphere was electric with possibility, a shared understanding that this night had witnessed something extraordinary. As the evening continued, she began to feel a sense of calm amidst the excitement. The adrenaline of performance had ebbed, replaced by a gentle satisfaction. She moved through the hall, acknowledging greetings and congratulations, her posture relaxed yet dignified. She had proven herself, not only through the music, but through the courage to step forward, to take a risk, and to trust in her abilities. She thought of the people who had doubted her, who had whispered or smirked or underestimated her. There was no anger in her reflection, only understanding. Their assumptions had been rooted in expectation, in appearances, in a world that often judged too quickly. By stepping into her talent, she had challenged those assumptions and changed perceptions, not with confrontation or words, but through action, skill, and authenticity. A small circle of guests remained near the piano, asking questions about her techniques, her practice, and her experiences. She answered honestly, speaking with a clarity and humility that reflected her genuine love for music. Her responses were thoughtful, revealing not only her skill, but her understanding of the effort, patience, and dedication required to cultivate it. The guests listened intently, some nodding in admiration, others making notes or sharing quiet excitement. The night continued, filled with conversation, laughter, and admiration. Yet even as she moved among the guests, her mind kept returning to the piano, the instrument that had become her voice, her connection, and her opportunity. She realized that this moment, this performance, had changed everything. It had opened doors, created possibilities, and affirmed the value of her dedication. It had shown her that courage, talent, and authenticity could overcome expectation and assumption, and that the recognition she longed for could indeed be realized. Eventually, the crowd began to disperse, the evening winding down with polite farewells and expressions of gratitude. The young waitress remained for a moment by the piano, letting her fingers brush lightly over the keys, feeling the echo of the music she had created. She reflected on the journey from quiet practice to this public moment, realizing that her life had been irrevocably changed by her decision to embrace her talent and take a risk. The music producer approached once more, offering reassurance and encouragement. "This is just the beginning," he said. "I see immense potential in you. If you are willing, we can work together to explore what you are capable of." She felt a sense of excitement, possibility, and determination. For the first time, she could see a path forward that included not only her passion, but a future where her talent could flourish and be recognized widely. As the hall emptied and the lights dimmed, she remained for a few quiet moments alone with the piano. She allowed herself to feel the full impact of what had happened, the recognition, the admiration, the opportunity, and most importantly, the reclaiming of a part of herself she had long set aside. She realized that the journey had been as important as the performance itself, that the courage to step forward, to risk vulnerability, had created a moment of profound transformation. With a final glance at the piano, she straightened, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The night had shown her that talent could not remain hidden forever, that courage could turn expectation on its head, and that recognition and opportunity could emerge in the most unexpected places. She left the hall with a quiet confidence, a sense of fulfillment, and the knowledge that her life had changed, not only because of what she had accomplished, but because of who she had chosen to become. The performance had been more than music. It had been a declaration of self, a triumph over doubt, and a bridge to new possibilities. The young waitress had stepped into her light, not for the applause, not for the approval of others, but for herself, for her passion, her dedication, and her unwavering belief in her own potential. Tha